Evolution in Divine Love is an invitation to reimagine everything from the place where it all begins and where it all returns. Love.
Welcome to another episode of Evolution in Divine Love podcast. Today we welcome back Swami Padmanabha, the author of Evolution in Divine Love, and Brother Alberto Varona, and we will be discussing the section called The Soul's Ever-Fresh Prospect According to Other Traditions. This is found within the third chapter called Mapping the Soul's Unbroken Potential. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Maharaj, you often speak of the soul's unbroken potential. And in this section, you go over different traditions' perspectives as well as authors. And you begin with Shakespeare. So how does Shakespeare's line, "We know what we are, but we know not what we may be," how does this echo Bhakti's insight?
Well, that basically, it's a way of saying that in my reading of it, we think we know we are, because even when he said we know what we are, actually at the end of the day, we don't know who we are, because who we are and what we can be is basically the same thing. We are units of potential, but we have certain ideas about who we are, who we think we are. But in terms of all that we can be in our potential, many times we have no clue. Many times we cling to our ideas of who we think we are, that provides us a sense of identity, and understandably so. And many times that prevents us from exploring who we actually are as units of potential and all that we can be. Because again, as you mentioned, the word unbroken that we used to title this third chapter of the book, and this is connected to the word apratihata, at least for me, which appears in the Srimad Bhagavatam, haituki apratihata, which is a definition of bhakti, which says bhakti should be haituki, causeless, and apratihata, unbroken. So it's its own cause, exists for its own cause, for the sake of more love, love for the sake of love, and it's apratihata, it's unbroken, it's irresistible, is ongoing, expanding current. So when we, again, unbroken potential of the soul, when the soul connects with love, puts itself under the influence of bhakti, we will say, one's potential becomes unbroken, which basically means not only it cannot be broken, but the idea is it's constantly actualizing itself into newer and newer heights or depths, right? So Shakespeare's quote for me indicates that even if we have an idea of who we are that is relatively accurate, all that we can be in the context of love surpasses our wildest imagination. And let's remain open to that prospect, right? And again, the openness to something that I don't know, because all that I can be, I don't know, that openness is a very healthy one. It may be a little unsettling because I don't know, but at the same time, it's very, how to say, gives a lot of reassurance and safety in terms of all that, even I don't know so much. If I remain open to all that I don't know in the context of love, so much is about to come.
This reminds me of you also quoting from T.S. Eliot, I think, saying that when we think we know someone, it's really the memory of the person when we met them last time or something like that, that they've already changed. So when we meet next, we are really meeting strangers, which is really so interesting and a challenge I often face myself, because I have like the older versions of people in my life and somehow expect them to be the same when I meet. So
Sorry, it's not happening.
what I realized in in relation to that is that it's actually an intentional effort that it takes to discover who the person is and to form a new connection based on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have like more thoughts on that?
Well, I would say that first of all, we have to begin all that with ourselves, right? I mean, it takes an effort, as you say, to get to know the other person one more time. And you mentioned T.S. Eliot, and I thought you were referring to a quote from this section, but actually the quote you refer is from another section. But this section has a quote from T.S. Eliot at the very end, actually, and it's very related also. It says, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive what we started and know the place for the first time." So it's very much a spiral dynamics statement, like the same place we started, the type of circular movement, but know the place for the first time. So it's never the same thing. So it's very applicable, not only again in dealing with other people and making a very, how to say, voluntary effort, intentional effort to really understand how actually everyone is evolving in its potential, but the same applies to ourselves. But probably sometimes we take for granted and underestimate again, not only others, but maybe mostly ourselves. And we take for granted who we are every day in the morning. Like, okay, I know who am I. I know who am I. And we create a sense of identity that basically becomes calcified there, instead of remaining open to rediscovering ourselves to begin with. So many times the difficulty we may experience in rediscovering others may be actually a sign of how the difficulty starts at home. And the more we remain open and curious, I will say that's a healthy word, curiosity. So the more we remain curious about not taking ourselves for granted, the more we can extend that same gift to others, so to say, right? And that's, again, it's so much, that creates so much spaciousness, and that gives so much air and relief and comfort, in the healthy way of the word, comfort in relationship with other people. Even if you don't say any word, if you come from that place of allowing them to be who they are, of being curious and open to rediscover them over and over again, that gives so much freedom to the other person, so much permission and empowerment. So it's felt in the environment even before you open your mouth. But again, that all that work begins with us and extends not only, I mean, to others, and in the others we include the divine also, because again, we can also compartmentalize everything and put everything compartments and boxes. So it's an ongoing discipline, and yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think of like how self-discovery is an essential, like self-discovery, self-knowledge is an essential step toward discovering God.
Yeah, and it's an ongoing one. Again, self-discovery, or sometimes we use the word self-realization. It's not just one thing that it happens, and once it happens, it's over. Okay, I'm self-realized now, so there's nothing else to realize there, right? I've discovered myself, so there's nothing else to be discovered there. No, it's a perpetual excavation project, so to say, in relation to us, in relation to the divine, to others, to material energy. It's a mine of wonder, so to say, so much to excavate from that.
And in this section also you mention the Christian mystic Gregory of Nyssa, and how he speaks of epicstasis, I think.
Ecstasis.
Yes, thank you. And which is the unceasing growth in grace. And hearing you speak, I can really see that grace, another way of saying grace is spaciousness and and allowing.
Yeah.
So you have a beautiful quote in here. If I just read a few lines from Gregory of Nyssa, and he says, "Well, through the new grace we may obtain something greater than what we had before. This does not place a limit on our ultimate goal. Rather, those advancing in perfection, the attainment of one good becomes the starting point for discovering higher goods. Thus, they never cease ascending, moving from one new being to the next, with the source of ever greater graces remaining boundless. So that's such a beautiful thing, and so in line with the message of evolution in divine love. So how do you see this also representing the mirroring the Gaudiya perspective of ever fresh love of God?
Well, it's basically that another articulation of the same principle, and I appreciated your point before the quote of equating grace with spaciousness, because that's basically what grace makes, right? Like to create more space for something that probably the moment before there was not space for that, because there was not that thing, whatever that may be. So now the thing is coming, it needs a space, and grace creates space, holds space. So yeah, it's a good one-liner for meditation. No? Grace as spaciousness, and how that can be embodied, right? Because if not, it can also remain a very abstract idea. How we can embody that? How can we, again, give grace to someone else? We should. It doesn't mean that, oh no, I'm nobody to show grace to anyone. Yeah, and one way will be create a space that has not been there before, so to say, or maybe it's there but the other person is not aware, and we need to be instrumental in invoking awareness of that broad, deep space that all of us need to feel that we belong again. And it's ever evolving, as we will always say. It's not just a fixed maximum, a particular number of breadth or depth, and this is grace, this is spaciousness, but it's an moving spaciousness, ongoing, ever accommodating that. So yeah, Gregory of Nyssa is a very interesting Christian mystic. I really like his notions. Basically he's explaining that in the context of grace, like one type of grace takes us to a particular experience or realization, and that opens us, hopefully, ideally, for a new level of grace. So grace takes us to a certain place if we open ourselves to that. But upon arrival, so to say, to that place, there is already a new grace, a new higher wood, that he will say, discovering higher woods available for us. So it's an ever-expanding market, so to say, of new woods in the markets, and new grace being available for us to reach there. So I really like the wording, and of course it's a different articulation than the one probably we will use in our contemporary times, in our particular tradition, but it's basically saying the same. So that's why I felt inspired to include it here, just to show and to humble ourselves, not to think, oh, it's only my tradition who thinks in these terms and speaks about this, but it's basically everywhere if we have the eye to capture that, or the honesty to acknowledge that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I can't help but, as you were speaking also, I was thinking more about the relationship between spaciousness and grace. And going back to that, it is really the case, because our wounds and our leftover unhealed parts really are like a condensing, like a black hole is, it's very compacted. So grace creates the ability to turn around, to very much turn around and to tend those things and unpack. We use that term, unpack. So you can't unpack something if there's no space to do that. So grace allows for the unpacking and the tending, to things that we have stuffed and not dealt with, and very much condensed and hardened. So I really appreciate that. So going to a further part in this section, Sridhar Maharaj, you bring him up about asking provocative questions about Jesus, and is where he was contemplating is Jesus stagnant or progressive? And I was wondering what's at stake in seeing Jesus as dynamic.
We have to ask that to those who do not accept that possibility. For me, there is nothing at stake. For me, the opposite. No, what's at stake, but not seeing him as such, that's a compromising of potential. But again, it's all tied to the idea of absolute perfection, because the context of these words of Srila Siddhar Maharaj are in the connection to conversations he's having with the Christian, and he will say, well, for us, Jesus has perfect knowledge. So again, the word perfect comes into the stage. And then that's when Srila Siddhar Maharaj say, okay, but what do you mean by perfection? There is no further depth and attainment and growth and expansion. Is perfection, again, a fixed maximum, a dead end? So that's basically the idea this particular Christian person was having, which again, as we can see, is not the thoughts of the thinking of every Christian, as we just quoted from Gregory of Nyssa. So that's when Srila Siddhar Maharaj makes this interesting statement about Christ, Jesus being dynamic, basically. No? Or basically, his questions go more in the other direction, in the negative. Is he stagnant? Is he finally fixed? Is he over, basically? I mean, has he reached? Is that finished forever? So it's kind of indirectly trying to make the point that we are talking about an enlightened being or God, if whatever are your beliefs about Jesus, and love and transcendence. So how much we can dare to put a conclusive seal, so to say, to the whole thing, which by nature is, in Srila Siddhar Maharaj's words, he will love to speak about that, is ever evolving, is in constant expansion. So, or as he concludes that section, he asks this person, is Jesus a member of the dynamic world, or is Jesus a member of the stagnant world? No, so I like that phrasing. No, are you, where lies your membership, basically? So yeah, it's all tied to this, again, in my opinion, imperfect notion of perfection, which, trying to defend perfection, we end up doing a disservice to it by limiting it in so many ways. No, at the end of the day, trying to say, no, this is complete, this is finished, this is a dead end, this is a fixed maximum, nothing else can be. And the more you say that, the more you push those points, the more limiting your idea of perfection becomes, the more suffocating, the more contradictory to something that is endless and infinite and ever expanding by nature. So that's one of the many paradoxes that we have with the words we use and the thoughts we entertain, that we have to engage with them in a way that still remains coherent with the actual realities of transcendence, right?
You know, what came to my mind when reading this particular part, Srila Sridhar Maharaj's words about Jesus, I was thinking how many of us, when we want to choose a guru, like we think of like, oh, the guru has to be a pure devotee, perfected being. So that kind of like, you know, that's a fixed state, and that person is going to help us get there. And that's like the end game, you know? And yeah, so sometimes we may feel the need that like, yeah, our guru, spiritual master has to be perfect.
Yeah, But again, when we say that, we are having our own ideas of perfection. Or when we say pure devotee or whatever, many times we don't even have a clear idea what does it mean. So it's just, of course, at the end of the day, what we want is someone who has more clarity than us and can guide us on the path, which is absolutely valid necessity, right? There is a place for that. There is a place for having in our life someone with deeper vision, more maturity, realization, experience, that can be an elder, be a mentor, be a guide. I mean, everyone needs that, I will say. There's nothing wrong in that, and it's not canceling our own will, it's not humiliating, degrading. It's beautiful when it happens from the proper place. So I will say that's the actual need. But sometimes that's becomes, how to say, packaged in the form of pure devotee and ideal, enlightened, state, eternal liberated. It ends up being more like an ego competition and labeling and a neurotic fitting in and trying to be the disciple of he whom everyone says that he or she is the pure devotee, because at the end of the day may have no way of assessing, establishing how much of a pure devotee that person may be or not. So yeah, I will say that at the end of the day, we need to find someone who is as our guide, sincere enough for us to feel trust in that person, and also advanced enough for us to feel that we can be nourished and guided by that person, and trusted by the very sincerity of that person, even if that person is not in the highest stage of development, which again, what's the highest? There's no rooftop. That person will continue to grow as we will continue to grow. So I think that's the actual necessity we need, instead of entering into a comparison, competition, and who is the best and who is the guru and this and that. And at the end, behind many of that, there are lots of insecurities and lots of attachment to certainty. Look, give me the topmost saint so I don't need to worry anymore about anything. And that's not how we are supposed to enter this sacred path. We are to confront uncertainty and think for ourselves, and again, remain open to ongoing growth. So no, even if your guide is super advanced, still can become more super advanced, and the same applies to everyone. In fact, we were talking about Jesus a moment ago, and there is this famous statement that he says to his followers that you will do greater things than me. So that's very interesting, right? Because some people say, well, he has perfect knowledge, there's nothing beyond him, but he's saying that to his followers, like showing we will say the dynamism of parampara, right? How every member of a particular line of transmission, if they're honest and open enough, the current flowing through the bloodline flowing through it can always continue to dance and express in newer and newer ways. So we should be very careful that in the name of honoring and praising our elders, we do not cut the current in the way of over glorifying them, so I don't have to bring anything bigger to the picture. Not because I'm better than I am, but that's just the nature of things. Ideally, the nature of reality has become more and more expansive. So what has expressed itself as expansive to a certain degree in my previous teacher, it has to become more expansive in me. Not because I'm better than my previous teacher, because that's the nature of reality. And I have to allow that to happen as a good disciple. And the same will happen with the next member of the chain, so to say, the succession, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, some thoughts.
Those are really amazing points. Did you have more, Swetadweep?
No, I was just saying, yeah, that's really amazing, beautiful.
When you were speaking, the one thing I was remembering in this section, you speak about process theology, because you point out many different traditions along the way that parallel the thoughts that are presented in evolution and divine love. So the one line is God evolves alongside us. So if God is always evolving, love is always evolving, of course our guides, our mentors will be evolving alongside us as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's how it works. Everything is evolving in its own pace, in its own way, but it is moving, it is evolving, it is drawn toward expansiveness or spaciousness, because again, that's the nature of the very root of reality, of the very source. So naturally, it all is consciously or unconsciously, but that's the luring, that's the invitation in that direction. No matter how expertly we resist to it, and of course that will take very distorted forms, but still the flute call, so to say, remains being that, and sooner or later we will be embracing that. So yeah, it's good to keep that framework in mind, how everyone is evolving in its own way, elders, seniors, juniors, God, the atom, you name it, you put the finger wherever you want, and then you will find some form of evolution. Evolution in divine love, the eternal becoming of God, soul, and matter. Thank you very much.
Welcome to part 2 of Evolution in Divine Love podcast, where we'll be speaking with Alberto Varona and discussing the section in the 3rd chapter called The Soul's Ever Fresh Prospect According to Other Traditions. Alberto Varona is a practicing clinical psychologist, a psychotherapist. He has a master's in divinity, and he's very familiar with Gaudiya Vaishnavism, having practiced for decades in that tradition. And now he identifies as a Christian. So he has a beautiful weaving of these two paths together. So he's a wonderful person to speak to about this. So thank you very much for joining us today, Alberto.
It's my pleasure. It's always so nice to be asked to do something like this. And I'm so glad that after all these years of knowing each other, we get to have this kind of conversation.
Yes, I'm glad as well, and I look forward to it. So we'll dive into the section. And in this part of the book, Swami Padmanabha writes a quote from Shakespeare, where he says, "We know what we are, but know not what we may be." So how do you hear this as a Christian, from the Christian side of you?
From the Christian side, in several ways, what I'm hearing there is about the kind of the mystery of what's forthcoming. I don't know the extent to which you know that even from a Christian context, there's a lot of unclarity of what the kind of trajectory is, like what's kind of the future hold. There's a couple of major ideas about kind of eternity and what it involves, and it's not 100% certain what that's going to look like. I'll talk about it more philosophically, I think, the way that Swami does in the book. But first, I just want to say that for the Christian, you have a couple of kind of prominent ideas of what comes after death. So in other words, the beginnings of eternity as we know it. The first kind of prominent idea is this idea of resurrection, which of course is famous in Christianity because of Jesus's resurrection being kind of the real marker of the start of the church. The idea that life can somehow go on in a very embodied way. Jesus's resurrection was a very interesting thing because even in the scripture, it's described as he's having a body, but the body itself also has distinct features that are not typically body-like features, right? So he could eat, but he could also go through walls, it seems. So very, very interesting kind of concept of the body. It reminds me a little bit of the idea of kind of a spiritual body in Gaudiya Vaishnavism as well, right? This idea that there's something body-like and then something body not like. So there may be some similarity here in terms of this unique entity, unique way of being an entity. So this resurrection idea is this idea that probably you will kind of sleep until your body is kind of reestablished into eternity, and that body will be of a different kind, and it'll go on into eternity. And then, so we don't even know that first initial kind of coming back into being, what that's going to be. And then there's this idea that's also quite prominent, quite Greek, this idea that you have a soul, eternal kind of subtle form of yourself. Not, excuse me, not sure what qualities it possesses in terms of kind of memory and emotion and some of these more psychological things, but it's a you-ness that goes on forever. And in that you-ness, you kind of enter into kind of some kind of ongoing relationship with God. And with other entities, right? In a community of kind of worshiping people into some form of kind of heavenly realm transcendence. And maybe the truth could be some hybrid. I don't know. It's kind of unclear. Within the second idea, in the first idea, you have this idea of kind of a reestablished earth, kind of an improved earth, the kingdom of God, and you go on in a different form of this world's life. In this second idea, with the kind of the self, the soul version that goes into transcendence, then I think is where I think the section of Swami's book really kind of makes the most sense. The question then becomes, what's the nature of our involvement there? And what's the nature of kind of our existence there into eternity? Scripture has some sense of that. If you read books like the Book of Revelation, John's Revelation, then you get some sense of like worship is ongoing. So prayers are ongoing, and you're in some kind of like a realm where kind of God is enthroned. But very, very kind of vague sense of kind of what living would be like. Jesus says somewhere in the scripture that you would not have spouses anymore, so relationships change. Right? You're now related to each other, but in a different way, with the kind of the rest of the community there, so on and so forth. And there's very little idea, at least kind of scripturally, in kind of what the unfolding, ongoing beingness of both God and man, you would be like. So not quite clear there. And then as Swami brings up in the text, right, he's quoting Shakespeare, but he quotes other people I think you'll mention later. There is some philosophy that's happened and some theology that's happened since kind of the beginnings of Christianity that kind of elaborate this, that suggest the possibility of God as kind of ongoing, always Godself transforming. Now, I want to say something about this because some of the things that Swami brings up are not necessarily kind of conventional, mainstream, orthodox kind of Christianity. They're kind of the more fringy spirituality-based Christianity where people are thinking outside the box, right, about all of these things. And that's when all of a sudden you start seeing kind of different traditions coming together. And the what I'm thinking there is he eventually gets to the place of process theology, right? Alfred North Whitehead is mentioned there. And there is this other way of thinking about God that contradicts some more orthodox ways. The more orthodox theology in Christianity is that God is a permanent, unchangeable being. And this is very important to kind of Jewish scriptural theology and Christian scriptural theology. The idea that God's being is, in a sense, permanent, static, and this, right? This is the word static reminds me of the citation of B.R. Sridhar Maharaj. Static somehow, that God is already everything that God can be, right? In some unchangeable, impermeable, right, way. And that's kind of the traditional way that people would often think about God. And then new thinkers come in and say, how could that possibly be? And I'm very interested in this kind of newer way of thinking that Swami is also, I think, quite in touch with, which is that God's self must also be evolving and changing. That's kind of one of the main premises of the book, from what I can gather. God's self is also evolving and changing. And for our purposes, there are some very basic ways that this must be true, in my mind, and in the philosophy of some philosophy of God thinkers. Simply by virtue of the fact that we continuously are changing and engaging in different ways of relating with God, God must be changing also in responsiveness to us. If God is truly in relationship with us, and God is therefore responding to the new ways in which we respond, interact, engage, love, then God's self must be also adapting to that. God by necessity has to be in transformation. Relationship requires it, right? So relationship requires that as I continue to be in relationship, then the people I'm in relationship with must also be kind of changing and responding and adapting. So God must be permeable, right? God must be changeable, right? And as my love increases, God's kind of responsiveness and love must also be increasing. So something like that.
Yeah, wow, that's wonderful and really thoughtful and deep. Thanks for sharing that.
Mm.
And I wonder if kind of like the lag of not seeing God as expanding himself, as God evolving himself. I do agree that it's due to how we see ourselves in relationship with him. But I wonder how many people, or in the Christian tradition specifically, kind of really have a sense of an ongoing or an evolving self, and then also like a relationship with God, right? If most people have the image of God as, I mean, the old generic kind of idea of God is an old man with a white beard, and somebody who's not, there's no real personal relationship there, then it would be easy to understand how they wouldn't comprehend or even see the necessity of God evolving. So I think that's a really important point that you made about seeing the relationship. So do you think that most Christians foresee in the future, when they go to heaven or the afterlife, that they would have a relationship, an ongoing, active relationship with God?
First, yes, because all these traditions that we're kind of talking through are all personal, traditions, right? Where God is conceived of in some kind of a personal way, and so, in a sense, there always is some sense of relationship, right, embedded in that idea itself, right? So in Christianity, there's a strong emphasis on always maintaining a sense of the creature and created. So the creator and the creature, right? Or the creator and the created, right? So there's always a distinction. Gaudiya Vaishnavism does the same thing. The idea that, and that implies that there must always be a relationship between two distinct, entities that could be related to each other, in some ways, right? But always have some distinctiveness as well, for the sake of relating at least. And I think the Christians I think their first kind of the place from which they live their faith is always from a place of believing that there's an interaction and a relationship going on there, or else they wouldn't bother praying. They wouldn't make any kind of petitionary prayers. They asking for things, right? Like asking for God to please do this or change your mind about that, or let this unfold differently, or protect these people. Or they wouldn't pray for a deeper relationship, which is not as typical of Christianity anyways, but it does for sure happen. That we ask for relationship, we ask for intimacy. So there's, I think, a real embedded sense that there's a relationship here, and that God is changeable, and that God would respond, right? The idea that God would have a new experience that God had not had before in relationship to me. I think that's definitely embedded in the idea of God there. The theological God of Christianity, this one where it's a permanent being, absolute transcendence, right? These ideas, I don't think are the lived Christianity. They're the on paper kind of theological ways of trying to make sense of something and solve certain philosophical and theological problems. I don't think that's the lived place. Even if you think about the guy with the beard, which by the way, has historical origin. I'm not sure the extent to which you all study that, but the that's kind of the artistic rendering, but it doesn't come out of nowhere. The God of the Hebrew Bible is kind of a blended figure. It's in part the God Yahweh, YHWH, right? The God Yahweh, which was a regional kind of deity at some point in time. And then there's a God that was also a regional deity, a Canaanite deity, El. And there's also Baal, but El was kind of a prominent figure who was always depicted as kind of the older man with a beard. He was the head of the Council of the Gods. And so when as Judaism kind of develops, you end up having a synthesis between El and Yahweh, both prominent kind of figures, with Yahweh becoming more prominent, and then the features of El got kind of mixed up with the features of Yahweh, and we basically think of Yahweh now as containing the features of El, basically. And that's where you get this old father image. Either way, even in the Hebrew scripture, you have God interacting, right? So even that God of the Hebrew scripture is like walking around the camp, right? They're seeing him as he walks by. They see the back of him, right? The backside of him, which people turn into a fun joke, right? They see the backside of him. Moses is interacting with him face to face, allegedly, which is why he glows, right? And so, so there's interaction even embedded in those very personal kind of understandings of God before God becomes so transcendent that you would imagine he's abstract kind of energy stuff, right? He's not really the force in Judaism, and I don't think in Christianity either, because in Christianity you have an even greater kind of concretizing of God in the person of Jesus, right? So always personal, I think. And I believe in Jesus becomes even more personal, really, I think intentionally. I think God does that intentionally for the sake of us being able to increase our sense of relationship with God's self, right? And Jesus himself is not static, obviously. In life, he changed. In resurrection, he changed, right? And that goes to the heart of that comment made by Bhakti Rakshak Sridhar Maharaj, right? So,
Yeah,
can I say
wow.
one thing about Shakespeare, by the way, that you could edit it out if you don't like it? That Shakespeare comment I thought was so interesting, because when you said it now, and then you asked me what I'm hearing from a Christian's perspective. I want to say what I hear from it from a psychological perspective too, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
The first part of the quote was, we know who we are now, or something like that. And that's not true either. We neither know where we're going, and we neither know who we are now. I mean, not in an absolute sense, but there's still mystery now about who we are. There's still so much to discover now about who we are. And if we take seriously the idea that some part of us goes on into eternity, details to be filled in, because it's a very interesting idea that we rarely talk about, what parts of us go on into eternity. Nevertheless, some parts of us, and some of those parts we don't even know about. And as we get older, right, I'm turning 50 in a couple of months. As we get older, we discover all these new parts of ourselves, because we are a process, right? And so as our own process unfolds, we know about ourselves more. And so we not only don't know what's going to unfold in us and in God into eternity, we don't even know which parts of us will be present when we even start to kind of enter into kind of our own eternity, which I'm assuming we usually mean in our death, but could mean also in our own kind of mystical development in this life, right? Which parts of us are moving forward?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question.
Wow. Yeah, I actually have so many questions, but from the most recent thing you were saying, I wanted to know a little bit more about seeing God's backside and seeing face to face. So
Yeah.
I'm curious how what is the difference? When you were saying that, I had a couple of thoughts. One was that, does it matter what side? Because God, God being God, every side should be the same. But at the same time, I also remember, like in Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, there is this analogy used that, kind of like turning back to God, or, seeing the backside of God or something like that, that we are away from light, that we don't see the truth or something like that. So I'm curious to know what it is like, in Christianity, like the version, I mean, I don't want to like, say Christianity in the general sense, like you were saying, there is like something that is on paper, and then there is like the more processed, like, newer understanding. So like, according to your understanding, like what is the difference that you're seeing, between those two, like seeing God's backside and seeing God face to face?
Well, when you extended it to talk about light, all of a sudden my mind went into kind of different places. First, I want to say that the first thought that comes to my mind when we're talking about light is that to turn away from God at the most it could ever do in my way of thinking. And I know I can't represent Christianity because it's not Christianity is itself not one thing. I can kind of represent Christianity as I live it, right, and as I experience it and experience it and believe it, right. And I think I'm kind of in a context of other Christians who maybe think like I do. I know Richard Rohr is mentioned in this text, so these are kind of like-minded kind of people, but I want to say first that when you turn away from God, I can't imagine that that could ever be more than a shadow. It could never be darkness. I think that feels to me like I've never said that before, so it's kind of it's a fresh idea in my mind. So I don't know how that analogy or metaphor will kind of unfold, but it could at best be a shadow to turn away from God. So you'd see things dim, and maybe you could even see them dim a lot. But that's because philosophically, in my view, there's nothing ultimately that can be separate from God. In other words, if you're using an analogy of God as light, there's nothing that could ever be separate from God. There is no two domains. There's one reality, one ultimate reality. And if light is the analogy, then if light is the kind of image we're using for God, then there's no place where there wouldn't be light. There could just maybe be shadows cast. And that it always feels to me like a temporary experience, right? Even Satan must be reconciled to God ultimately, right? The idea that there could be nothing that would ultimately ever be able to have permanent existence outside of God, in my mind. So anyway, so that's one thing. So in that sense, the front side of God, the back side of God matters really more in terms of kind of personal relating, right? In other words, which aspect of God are we kind of currently looking at? Is God walking away or is God walking toward, right? So these are very fun ideas, that we really have most life if we start thinking of something like Gaudiya Vaishnavas think of in terms of Leela, right? In terms, there might be some really fun things we can think about there in kind of a pastime way. But philosophically, there is no ultimate separation, right? There could only be experiences of separation. And that's the idea. In Christian tradition, Jesus is referred to as the light of the world, right? The light, in other words, kind of God coming into the world and kind of illuminating it, right? And I think, and as we're approaching Christmas now, Advent and then Christmas, we're approaching the time in which we're anticipating the light, right? We're anticipating the light, which, not accidentally comes, as winter is approaching, right? The idea of kind of bringing light back into a dark world. So in my mind, that feels like a very important image, the of light, that kind of, it's almost like, if I'm kind of letting myself take that further, the idea that God is the light, but God ignited kind of a special light into the world and extended himself into a light in the world in the form of the person of Jesus, who illumined the lives of the people that he was with, and then illumined the lives of, billions of people onward, right, into infinity, right? Jesus, the impact that Jesus has had on the world is like shocking. The idea that some Jewish person in this period of time, interacting with a kind of a handful of people in a tiny little region of that, of this kind of Roman kind of empire dominated space that would still be talked about nowadays, is just so weird. It's so weird. So for me, it feels like a real kind of source of kind of faith, that light, something was lit up then, and it's kind of been continuously extended by all these saints onward, right? Today's All Hallows Eve. Tomorrow's the feast of All Saints, right? So in Christianity, so it's the feast in which we celebrate the way that light is carried forward by all these people, right? Who then become new icons of, you know, of the faith. And it's just so very beautiful to me. Am I getting close to what you were kind of wondering about?
Yeah, thank you so much. It was beautiful, whatever you shared. And what came to my mind is this analogy of cloud. Like on a cloudy day, we don't see the sun, but there is still light. So we know there is light, but it's not like the full version of the light, that the sun would
Yeah.
normally cast. So yeah, that's what came to my mind. And I was thinking about like Christmas coming in winter. What you were saying is also when the day starts getting like longer.
Yeah.
So it's like, lighting and the lights becoming brighter and brighter as you go.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
when you're talking, when you bring up clouds, you bring up several other images. First of all, I don't know if you know, but the God of the Hebrew Scriptures is talked about as coming on a cloud, right? Kind of appearing on a cloud. It's believed by some scholars that the God Yahweh was considered to be kind of maybe at some point it had some origins in kind of storm clouds. It may also be that that's kind of a gathering of qualities from other deities of the region too, but comes on a cloud with thunder, right? And that reminds me also of Krishna coming in this in a being the color of a storm cloud, Shyam, the color of love, right? Erotic love, um, and even then, right, Krishna would be then kind of Krishna as a cloud would be kind of a shadowed cloud, and so anyways, all these kind of divine images associated with a cloud. But in terms of the light, I think you're right that the darkest it could ever get where the sky is really kind of blocked as much as it can get blocked, would nevertheless always have to filter some light, right? It would
Mhm.
always have to, there would always be light filtered for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Another thing I was thinking is also like, talking about God. You also mentioned how there is like very less information about the afterlife in Christianity. So I was just wondering, how is it for you, like, being part of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, where everything is like, all the specifics are given, and like, going to a tradition where there is much less information about it, which can be used as an argument by some that like, oh, there is not enough given there, so that is like less bona fide or something like that. I don't buy it, but I'm just saying that's some can use that argument to say like, oh,
Yeah.
we want to be here where there is so much information given, like so much is known. So I'm curious how you are seeing it, like in terms of just moving on to a practice where you're where you want to be, like where you want to honor the mystery, like, be okay with not knowing.
Yeah, I think the first thought I have is, how quickly can we become comfortable with the fact that we're entering into kind of a mystery, right? How quickly can we get comfortable with this idea? So on the one hand, while I'll Gaudiya Vaishnav might say, you Christians know less about eternity, so therefore your tradition is in a sense less developed or less. Um, I, I would say, oh, it just sounds to me like it's going to take you a little longer to kind of enter into the mystery of this whole thing that's about to happen for you. I I fortunately had to do it sooner because I became a Christian again, which was my original tradition actually. Um, I became a Christian again, so the vagueness of it required me to kind of enter into mystery a little sooner than you. Interestingly, in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, all the details are not given. The entrance criteria are given. The entrance criteria for Leela are given. The Leela itself is kind of given a shape, right? So you've got kind of the beginning, middle, end is actually cyclical, right? So the Leela will kind of like, um, to the extent that the idea of eternity for a Gaudiya Vaishnava is entering into the pastoral Leela of Krishna, right? You have this idea of a cyclic system where a cycle of life that ends at at the possibility, I think, of Krishna departing to his, royal Leela. And at that point, in the kind of madness of the inhabitants of Raj, they go into an ecstasy only to find themselves kind of back again in early childhood, right? Right. This idea that it all kind of loops. And that in a sense is already kind of a restraint on the idea of Krishna's pastimes because there's others, There's others that you could have entered as well, and these are going to loop. But within that loop, by the way, there's always the idea that new things are going to happen, right? New things are going to happen. You're going to enter all of a sudden, right? So now I'm just talking about Krishna Lila, right? In Krishna Lila, there's always this idea that you're going to be sitting at the table, no, sitting on the ground, not at the table, sitting on the ground under a tree somewhere, feeding each other and having a fun time. And all of a sudden, this other friend shows up who's always been there, but just showed up, right? The paradox of all that. And that's your new friend who just arrived, right? Oh, yes, we've been waiting for you. Here you are again, right? So the idea that new people would enter into the Leela, right, already introduces parts that you don't know about. You won't know about. It's impossible to know. It hasn't happened yet. This person has not yet entered the Leela. It was always a possibility. It was always a potential in God's mind. Or maybe it was a kind of a must happen, right? But nevertheless, it still unfolded in Leela time. And so there's always mystery also in the idea of the Krishna Leela. Like, what will Krishna want to eat today, and what will I feed him? And what will my ministry be to him today? How will I serve him? What will the gopis say? So in Christianity, that you're right. Like, we really don't know. We really don't know what eternity is going to be like. And the descriptions we get are pretty boring. But the idea, if you're there, I'm guessing it would feel very ecstatic. It must feel ecstatic. And mystical life here feels like an increase of ecstasy, right? That's the idea of that's the mystical idea, at least in the traditions that feed me the most as a Christian. The idea is that ecstasies increase, right? The experience of God infusing in us. This is very similar to ideas you find in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, by the way. The ideas of the infusion of God's grace into you, God's Shakti, you could say, it causes increase in ecstasies. And so there's this kind of ongoing sense of this is going to get more and more beautiful. It doesn't even matter what happens. It doesn't matter whether we're all going to be in a field, or if we're all going to be kind of on a cloud, or if we're all going to be in, it's going to be of transformations of ecstasy, right? And that's a very similar idea. I'm thinking here of Teresa of Avila and Saint John of the Cross, who are my favorite mystical theologians in Christianity. But I'm also thinking about how deeply formed I am in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu's idea of all this and the theology of it, which is longing. I know we're going to at some point probably talk about longing, lobha, longing and faith, that these are all developments of faith. And as the faith develops, so does the ecstasy, so does the potential of this. And so in my mind, if some Gaudiya Vaishnava were to say that to me, I would say, oh, we're all entering into a mystery, and what we know about it is going to be kind of a constant unfolding of kind of ecstatic kind of love and experience, right? Maybe not only love, right? But nevertheless, certainly love, right?
Wow. It's interesting, actually, as you were speaking, I was thinking of Saint Teresa of Avila, and you mentioned her name because I recently read her book, The Interior Castle, which is like the Madhurya Kadambini of Christianity. And I was thinking, yeah, like, she has these experiences, where she has the visions and she's seeing, things like not the external vision, like how we see the world, but she says like vision in the heart and things like that. So yeah, being in the mystery, things are revealed. And on the other hand, if we kind of get these ideas already, like, being told to us, like we perceive them with the material, like, the way we perceive things already, and not understand they're so much different than what we already know, so there is that risk of misunderstanding afterlife and, like, the transcendental realm.
Yeah, holding ourselves back with our concepts, right? The idea that we have these beautiful concepts that it's supposed to kind of inspire us, but they're supposed to inspire us toward experience. They're not supposed to become then, the permanent scaffold from which we experience reality into infinity. They're supposed to be kind of a starting point for us to get to experience, right? You think about here, kind of the deeper levels of kind of meditational practice in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, the idea that you would at some point get to the point where you're qualified to meditate on, your form, your spiritual form, your spiritual dress, your spiritual qualities, your service into eternity for Krishna. Those are just starting points. Those are meditations that are hopefully derived from someone's mystical experience. But if they could just, even if they're just kind of made up by some holy person, they're nevertheless meant to be a place for you to start and kind of stimulate your kind of engagement with the experiential life, right? And God then would respond accordingly. And in Christianity, it's really a very similar idea. You can't hold yourself back with already expecting who God is going to be and how he's going to show up into your life. You create kind of a space for yourself to kind of be open to experience. And that's how Teresa Avila talks about it. You can't make God infuse God's self, God's graces into us. God will do that on God's own time and in God's own way. But we certainly prepare ourselves for it. You make ourselves available for such an experience to not only happen, but to be paid attention to, experienced, right? And opening up. A similar thing, I remember there was always some question as to whether, in Gaudiya Vaishnavism also, whether you can kind of make Krishna give you kind of your Shakti and your spiritual kind of, all these different kind of dimensions of spiritual realization, right? And I remember Swami Tripurari used to always say, you chant as if your spiritual life depended on it, knowing that it depends completely on Krishna. And he would also say, chant in such a way, how is it Swami would say that? He would say, chant in such a way that it's something like, I'm paraphrasing now because I don't remember how he would say it. He would say that you would kind of sweat and work so hard in your spiritual practice that Krishna will feel sorry for you and respond, right? And I think I love this idea that you just kind of, all you can do is kind of create conditions in which the experience of God becomes more possible, more likely, and then we still have to accept that it's out of our control and it's out of our concept, right? It's going to be something new always, even if it looks similar to what you thought it was going to look like, right? You find yourself as a gopi in the field, you're going to be still surprised by something. You're still going to be surprised by something, right? The experience itself is always going to be different, right?
That
Anyways.
reminds me, just of this month is, the month of Damodar. So, Krishna in this Leela, he sees that Mother Yashoda is trying so hard to be able to tie him up that she's sweating.
Oh,
and he takes pity on her and allows her to tie him, giving
yeah.
the mercy.
That's exactly the context in which I think Swami Tripurari would speak about that often, was to kind of use her as a model for, how that experience will unfold. Yeah.
Yeah, and this also reminds me of the quote from Gregory of Nyssa that we spoke of just a few moments ago with Swami Padmanabha in this section, but it really ties in, and it's kind of worth repeating. If you don't mind, I'll just share a little piece of it. So this is from the Christian mystic Gregory of Nyssa, and he says, while through the new grace we may obtain something greater than what we had before, this does not place a limit on our ultimate goal. Rather, for those advancing in perfection, the attainment of one good becomes the starting point for discovering higher goods. So that's very much like what you were saying. Mm-hmm. You're saying we're given these things and these are entry points. But as you were saying that, I was saying, but every moment is an entry point.
Yeah.
Forever.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Everything that unfolds then becomes the conditions on which the next thing unfolds. This is where Alfred North Whitehead is so helpful, who Swami Padmanabha mentions at the end of this section. Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy of process kind of captures that very, very well. That as things are in process, at some point they kind of kind of concretize enough to be what we call an actual entity, right? A kind of a being that persists for a period of time, although never static. Even then, in the experience of kind of persistence, right, of kind of identity or quality, it's always still unfolding, but there's a period of time in which the persistence is such that you could identify an actual entity to exist. But that just becomes the condition under which the next unfolding comes to be. This is the philosophy of reality as we know it, right? And what we're talking about in this chapter is simply extending that into eternity and into the eternal, into the eternals, the entities that we believe to be in existence forever. And so it's always something unfolding into becoming the conditions for the next. And in this life, psychologically, our body, our mind, everything is just like that as well. It's a new kind of coming into being of a new collection of processes, right? That that interact in such a way to give us our sense of existence and being. The Buddhists are going to take that idea they're going to dissect that. And then the kind of the theists are going to, in a sense, fortify that, right? So the Buddhists are going to dissect it. The theists fortify this idea that at one moment we identify the collection of processes as a being, who we are. But all that then begins to continuously transform into new forms of even ourselves, right? Continuous and separate, continuous and new. Always, I could think of myself as being, a young kind of gothic kid at the age of 16, and I could still see myself there, right? And I could still see me in that. And then I could also see all the ways in which I'm very transformed from who I was then, right? So that's just the nature of ongoingness of it all.
Yeah. The paradox
And
of
when
changelessness and
the paradox of what? Say it again.
the paradox of changelessness and evolution.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I love that. And I think that when we talk about growth, which is also another word I believe that was in this section as well, the idea of growth also requires that one thing build upon another thing, right? One thing builds upon another thing. In other words, you can't have a future without having had a past, right? The future needs everything that it's building upon. I don't know if you know, but the brain is like that. The brain itself is kind of a historical entity that you could see, kind of the ancient origins of our kind of organismic life in the brain itself. You can track the structures from kind of very, very primitive life all the way through up to kind of what we consider ourselves to be like kind of higher life. It just means more complex life, but complex is not necessarily better. Complex is just more complex, right? But you could see the whole history of kind of at least our line of species in our brain. So everything is a kind of a building upon.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I'm wondering about the brain and the complexities, because it seems like if we look at quote unquote lower species, it seems like what's evolving is the capacity to love and to know in love. So I'm wondering if also if you kind of see that also the evolution from the lower forms of species to the higher species is a consciousness. And if you think that is kind of connected to the development of a brain, to the finer tissues, to the developing of a vessel that has the capacity to hold these ideas, senses of self, different experience.
Yeah, it's kind of very kind of complicated area for me because I tend to often also try to think outside the box. And this is kind of the more tradition amongst the more kind of fringe ways of thinking about this stuff in spirituality. This is the mainstream of that fringe, which is to think of this of kind of the lower to higher, continuum, with humans, of course, being the most evolved or the highest form, some version of anthropocentrism, which is like making humans kind of the most important. And then God is like us, or we are like God. And so, of course, we must be then the best. And then these ideas, which are very compelling, I'm not trying to undercut the ideas themselves, that love is a very kind of special unfolding that becomes possible, to the extent that we have a more kind of complex nature. Consciousness, being the complex consciousness, and the most important piece here being that we have self-reflective consciousness, right? That we can see ourselves, look, reflective consciousness at all, that we can not only have experience, but we can notice that we have experience, so that we have an awareness of our experiences, which really kind of amplifies experience in really beautiful ways, including awarenesses of, ultimate reality. We could even conceive. We have abstract thinking and reflective consciousness, and we could think about God now, ultimate reality as God, right? This is why people like, I think it was Teilhard de Chardin who said, maybe it was Teilhard de Chardin who said that we are reality finally able to think about itself, right? Or we are the reflective capacity of God. We are God for the first time able to think about God's self through us, right? And I love these ideas. So these are very beautiful ideas. But I also find that, in a sense, if we're thinking about interaction with God or interaction with reality, um, ultimate reality or kind of temporal reality, sometimes the other animals just do such a much better job of just kind of responding appropriately to whatever is, right? And so much of the spiritual literature and the mystical literature is about kind of subduing our will to just be available to what God wants and to respond to God as God wants. In other words, softening our kind of self-determinants, right? And just respond to God. In some sense, the other animals do much better, right? But I do agree. I do agree that kind of the cultivation of love and the cultivation of consciousness seems to be a very important part of what we consider to be kind of spirituality and spirituality into eternity, so that we can imagine that in eternity it would be kind of continuous unfolding and expanding of consciousness and love. It's a very rich idea. I think it's got great potential. Um, I just want to say one thing about evolution here, though, because I study evolution quite a bit, and evolutionary models and contemporary evolutionary models. And from that point of view, we don't place humans at the kind of pinnacle of the whole, the hierarchy of beings. We don't put the humans at the pinnacle here at the top and say, oh, we're the best. We no longer think that way, because all organisms can become more complex. Read here, love and consciousness, right? All organisms can become more complex, and they can become more simple as needed in interaction with the world. So part of, in my mind, being responsive to God is to simply be adaptable. If God needs us to be more complex, then we'll become more complex. If God needs us to be more simple, then we'll be more simple, right? Read here the Shikshashtakam, right? More humble than a blade of grass, right? This idea that God needs us, in a sense, to become more simple, more malleable, right? Flexible like a reed, like flexible like the grass. This is not about humans becoming more and more complex. It's about humans becoming more and more simple, more and more malleable, right? So in that sense, there's another way of thinking about that, I think, too. It's all about being able to kind of adapt to the world you find yourself in. And if we translate that world to God, it's about finding yourself to be the most adaptable to God that you can possibly be. So that as the relationship demands something else, you're ready for that next demand, right? Whatever that might be. I don't know. That's kind of that's a new way of thinking.
I love that perspective. I want to throw this in there also, that it seems like it's not just the adaptability, but the willingness, and the willingness to be malleable, the willingness to be adaptable, which where the animals might not, which we're assuming, I don't know, I don't remember, but that an animal might not have the capacity to offer the willingness. They just are adaptable because of who they are, the bodies of this, whatever. They are part of the plan, but not so much the will, but as humans, as persons, we have the capacity to willfully surrender, to willfully bend. What do you think about that aspect?
Well, my first thought is that animals don't need to be willing, because the way that their organism works is simply that it just responds. Right? So it doesn't need willfulness in order to kind of adapt and respond to whatever is being demanded, right? So it doesn't need, but I do agree with you for 100%. The human definitely needs to become willing to respond to God, or willing to respond to reality, because we have such strong willfulness. We've unfolded in a particular way, which is to kind of be able to make some decisions on our own, right? We have choice points. They're really not as great as people like to think our choice points are. They're actually quite minimal. When you really start to study psychology, you really find out that people really don't feel like they really don't experience themselves as having as many choices as we like to think they do. And part of the psychology is to simply help them have some sense of choice again, right? But nevertheless, to the extent that we do have some say over our life, then our kind of relationship to God is in part making ourselves willing again to relinquish our own willfulness, using our will to will ourselves to be more flexible and responsive to what God wants and what God. So we have to then undo our willfulness, or utilize our willfulness in a particularly God-directed way, so that instead of seeking out our own well-being, our own selfish well-being, we're seeking out relationship instead. And so that is really an important choice point for the spiritual aspirant, right? At some point, you choose instead God instead of my own kind of agenda and plan. So yeah, so I agree. Like I said, this is still something. It's kind of a new idea for me, and I'm not sure where I am with it, but I like it. I like it.
Yeah, it's cool. And one other thing that just came now, to equate will with the self, I think there's some connection there, that a lot of the sense of self comes with will. So when we surrender our will, then there's a surrender of the self, and then how that ties in also with love, to have a conscious, willful offering of oneself. But saying that, I'm also, while you were speaking, seeing how, okay, we always think that we progress to the higher, going towards human, but what
That's
if
the
the
assumption,
higher,
yeah.
but what if the higher was the blade of grass? And in their past life, they had reached this willfulness, and in the next life, they get to with willingness, in the next life, they are awarded being a part of God's plan just by nature.
I love what you're saying. I had several thoughts while you were saying that, but when you got to this blade of grass, you really caught me, because the Krishna theology has that. The grass and the trees and all these things are also entities. The Gaudiya Vaishnav mystical journey does not involve kind of a series of kind of meditations on how to become grass, right? In terms of like being grass in the Leela, but they also understand that those are entities. Those are all entities there who take part in facilitating the Leela, just like, you know. So anyway, so in a sense that theology is there, but of course not a lot of people were like, oh yeah, I can't wait to be kind of a blade of grass in the Leela, right? Um, and that's the first part that kind of stood out to me. Well, how did you start this? There's something else I wanted to say there, that you started it. You
The
started it
will,
from a
the
oh
willfulness
will
connected
yeah
to self, and then again
yeah.
connected to love.
See, this is where we can't. I think we could go on forever dancing around the idea of the question of the self and what we actually are and what goes on into eternity. It feels to me like such a relevant question. I've been talking about this for years. I teach a class on the psychology of religion, And in the psychology of religion class, there's a whole section on the idea of going on, right? Continuing into eternity, which is one of the major things that religion provides people, as a sense of a response to the problem of our mortality, right? Or at least our alleged mortality, right? And so the soul becomes an idea that basically comforts people. I'm not saying whether it's true or not, but the idea comforts people into believing that their end is not really an end, right? And that's a real kind of a psychological motive. Whether it's true or not doesn't matter. It psychologically has a function, which is to comfort people into eternity. But the question of what goes on into eternity is definitely a mixed bag. And I am very skeptical, always. This is one of my biggest faith challenges, right? I am in some ways, thank you, I'm loving it too. I am in some ways very skeptical of kind of a core principle of most theistic religion. So I'm agnostic on this. I lean theistic. I don't know if you've heard that agnostics either lean theistic or lean atheistic, but I'm always an agnostic, somebody who really kind of wonders in an open-ended way about what's true or not true, which makes it very hard for me to settle in a faith, right? All my spiritual teachers have known this about me. But I lean theistic, meaning I really want these things to be true. I really want them to be true, so I lean in. But when it comes to the ideas of the soul, I definitely lean more Buddhist. It's very hard for me not to. And then I kind of try to kind of pull myself out of the unraveling that the Buddhists do. The question then becomes, in this collection of experiences that we consider ourselves, which are the ones that can go forward into eternity? The popular one is consciousness. This is where you hear it all the time. I remember Swami Tripurari picked up on this because there was all this consciousness studies going on in our world, right? And so as soon as consciousness studies started kind of becoming a popular field, Swami Tripurari, my former teacher, really grabbed onto that and did some beautiful work unfolding this idea, right, of kind of eternity and consciousness. And a lot of other spiritual writers and thinkers did the same thing, and it's still very prominent. So then consciousness, your conscious part, is the one that goes on. But let me tell you, that is a very bare bones way of moving forward into eternity. I know it sounds so romantic and beautiful, philosophical, but it's very bare bones. If all we go with is, if the only thing that goes forward is our ability to be aware, and then we just put ourselves in new conditions where we are aware of Krishna's Leela, heaven, God, whatever we want to fill in the content with. Well, it's maybe lasting, but it's pretty bare bones. I would be very sad if my memories didn't go with me, at least some of them. If my loves didn't go with me, right? If my favorite topics of conversation, if my books, right? There's so many parts of me that feel so rich, right, that I would hate to leave behind. When someone tells me from a Christian context that I won't be married to my spouse in eternity, I'm like, well, forget it then. Forget it. Forget it. There's so much of what is real to me now that I want to be part of that kind of, kind of ongoing being. And I would be very remiss to lose all that. This was a very big, difficult part for me of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, I'll be honest with you. You could leave this in or you could take it out if you want, but the idea that I would be a new person with new motives and new feelings and new preoccupations and a new style, new outfit, and it'd be Indian and new foods and like everything would be this whole new thing, and it's all kind of already planned out for me, and you should cultivate it. And I'd be like, wait. Hold on. That sounds beautiful, but wait, what about all the old me's? And, will there not be, will there no longer be French fries in eternity? Like, oh, no, Krishna likes fries too. Oh, okay, good. Well, like leaving the old behind felt to me like a very big loss, actually. That was one. I mean, there was other losses that I experienced in the idea of eternity and Gaudiya Vaishnavism. I think it was overly loaded with kind of a plan for me, But either way, I think that what goes forward feels very important to me, And that's why I kind of lean Buddhist in this regard, because I almost feel like if we are eternal, anyway, I think I'll leave that there because I don't want to get into Buddhism.
Yeah, I would like to say something in regards to that and see where it lands for you. We also are coming up to the hour mark, so I want to pay attention to that. But I guess I don't buy that old script of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. I don't see that what is here is left behind and I go somewhere else and it's already there. I just feel that I just become more of who I am now. I don't know who I am in total, but whatever, just like now, who I am now is everything that was from my past. All of my past and my past lives are here present with me now. It's making me who I am in this very moment. And the future, I don't think exists. It exists in such a way that it's simply resting back upon this moment. And as this moment unfolds more and more, then the future itself unfolds, but it's not already there. It's not like it's there and I just need to catch up to it. It only develops in the moment that I'm in right now. So just as we change and grow in this life, and some things that no longer work for us are left behind, and our desires change and our tastes change as we get older, we do have change, and everything comes with us. And I don't think that the process of going into the future is any different than what we are already experiencing now. I don't think we will feel a sense of separateness of who we were and who we are. It's just such a step by step that it looks like, oh, when I'm there, I'm not going to remember who I am. But every step, every coming closer, every petal unfolding is developing who I am into the future forever. And I don't think we leave anything behind that is still important to us.
It's reminding me of Swami Padmanabha saying, when you feel like you can do something forever, you've already touched eternity, which means like if there is something we actually love that, oh, we could do this forever, that means we don't have to leave that behind when we go ahead, like, so it's comforting also, right? Like, yeah, we love this. We want this to be part of us in eternity. So, yeah. And I love all the discussion. I mean, I didn't say much, but I just loved all of the discussion regarding like animal lower forms and human form and all of that. Just so amazing. One thing that came to my mind is in Mahaprabhu's Leela, there are instances where like a dog is liberated or like, goes to the spiritual world. It's like the dog's not chanting or like, doing the different processes, but how is it going? And like, so that's what came to my mind. And I thought, wow, that is actually really beautiful that to consider, yeah, there's no hierarchy. There may not be a hierarchy as such. And it's not that, consider, okay, now humans, we have like a higher level of reciprocation. Or that was interesting to me to hear when you were saying that it's not that like, being humans means that now we can reciprocate better or like something like that. Because I thought that was the difference, that humans could reciprocate better or in a higher way than animals could. But then you were saying that's not the difference. The thing with humans is like we have the ability for self-reflection. Yeah. So yeah, that's very interesting. And like I'm going to be thinking about it.
Me too. I wanted to say, Bhakti Rasa, I like your idea, much better for sure. There's no doubt. Whether it's orthodox, not orthodox, who knows? But I like your idea better that we always would, of course, come with ourselves all through time, like bringing all of ourselves forward into that new experience. And that makes more sense to me. To the extent that anything moves forward, it makes more sense that some substantial sense of self moves forward. Although it's very clear that in the Leela, people are no longer in any way actively remembering their former selves, whatever. But I like your idea very much. And this other idea, by the way, of the going back to the willfulness, let's look at the Christian motif of kind of humans coming into being. The Christian motif is the garden. And in this motif, this is obviously it's obviously not a literal tale. That's the first thing, right? It's always meant to have been an informative myth, right? It says something about the coming into being. So in that sense, we'll treat it like that and learn from it. The idea is we are created, placed into a garden, and in that garden you are already you are already in contact with eternity. This is an eternal space, and God is literally in the garden walking around with you. The relationship is established. And it's the willfulness that stops it. It's the desire to kind of go your own way, develop your own intelligence, make your own decisions, that kind of all of a sudden fractures the whole kind of idyllic and permanent ongoing relationship with God in an eternal realm, which is the garden. The garden is already a perfected place. Lots of questions here about like why there's a serpent in there already and why he's already such a troublemaker. Where did he come from? Why is he in the idyllic realm? Who knows? But the point is the humans lose the state. And so it's always about also in that context, working against your willfulness to go your own way, to get back into a state of rightness with God. Now, of course, in Christianity, that involves a whole lot of stuff around sin and such, but nevertheless, the idea is to get back to a state before your willfulness, when your relationship with God was kind of already in a great place, right? Already in a great relationship, and now you have to just kind of undo what you did wrong, which is to become willful. And it's a statement about how humans have evolved, I think. Of course, conservative Christians don't think of it that way, but they think of it as a literal story, and it gets very weird very fast. But the idea is that, about how humans evolved to become very strong decision makers. Our conscious mind, our reflective minds, and our ability to make decisions. In other words, the ability to make decisions means you've got all the environment pressing upon you, and then you've got all your impulses inside. And what you do is you could literally inhibit your impulse and your decisions and your automatic responses, inhibit them long enough to decide whether you want to make this, act on this urge, act on that impulse, or do a third thing that no one expected. This is the idea psychologically, right? That you could inhibit long enough to actually make a decision, right? We really aren't making that many of those, but it's a potential. Well, the idea here is go back before you ever had any of that, where you're just kind of just there, already responding to the divine reality as it already was, something like that. I've never thought that through like that, but it's an interesting idea, I think, for me.
Yeah, that is cool. And luckily it's recorded, so you'll be able to revisit your own thoughts again and rethink them and revamp them. And at this time, I think we'll bring this conversation to rest now. And thank you very much for bouncing ideas around, for exploring the willingness to explore.
Yeah.
I think it was really beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for even thinking that I would have something to say here. It's so nice. I spend my spiritual life is very isolated for the most part. And so it's always so nice when anyone thinks that I might have something to kind of offer or contribute. It feels very like a real honor to me. So thank you.
Yeah, and obviously we were right.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you did have so much to say and offer. And I'm thinking it has left us with questions for sure. And the viewers, listeners also, I'm sure it's leaving with a lot of questions, which is awesome. So yeah, thank you very
Yeah, I like to wonder a lot, right? So that's kind of my way of being. And the consequence of that, I should say this for kind of intellectual honesty, right? The consequence of my way of being is that I rarely get to experience what it's like to feel settled in faith, right? I just can't experience feeling settled, or I haven't so far been able to experience feeling settled in the faith, because I have so many questions that unfold every single time I arrive at one new answer. Is that constant evolving again? Every time I kind of settle one question, I'm like, oh, but that opens up this other thing. And I can't help but think sometimes that this is the way that God uses me, that God uses me. I mean, use in the most beautiful way, right? This is the way that God is in relationship with me, that God utilizes me to kind of ask questions, right? And to stay always very open and open to the new thing, a new thing. And my engagement with eternity is to constantly be kind of grasping at it. I spend my whole spiritual life grasping at reality, at ultimate reality, grasping at God and begging God to let me have a simple experience of it. And God's always like, maybe not. Maybe not for you. So, thank you. You're always welcome to invite me again if you want. I would love to continue talking with you both.
Thank you. Definitely sounds like a continuation is needed. And at this moment, we will take a pause and invite our audience to contemplate some of the topics that were brought up today and how to bring these things into their lives. So thank you all very much for joining us here.
Almost every mystical school agrees that the soul's potential is endless and constantly renewable. Were you aware that this idea is consensually expressed across so many spiritual traditions? How do you feel about this universal intuition, reached independently by countless souls who have never met yet share this profound understanding?